So Max Engling, thanks for sitting down with us. Congratulations on winning the Republican nomination for Secretary of State. Have you celebrated at all?
So we took Father's Day off. That was great. I hung out with my kids and my wife and some of my family, and it was very nice. But we are full bore straight ahead into the general election. So excited to be back at it now here and pushing to November.
You entered the race just a month really before the convention. What happened that made you decide now was the time to run?
Yeah, it came out of the grassroots effort around these delegates that said we need somebody that we can get behind in the fall, that we can run with, that we trust to get us across the finish line. And they didn't feel that they had that in this race. And so I had worked directly with them to spin this up. And then after a series of weeks, then Senator Banks came to me and said, I know these folks are talking with you, and if you are prepared to go, then we're going to push off together and make sure that we can go out and win this race. And so I've been very, very honored and humbled to have the support of great statewide leaders like Senator Banks, like Attorney General Rokita, like the two folks that are on the statewide ticket with me, with Comptroller Elise Nishala and Treasurer Daniel Elliott, and many others. And it's been wonderful to have that support, but also to know that this came out of a grassroots effort to say, how do we make sure that we keep our conservative values in this important position?
How crucial do you think those endorsements were?
Very helpful, very helpful. Getting one, it's a quick race. You have to get your name and your information out there very quickly. And so it's both having those folks helping to push and great conservative folks like Senator Banks to say, hey, I trust this, he trusts me. And also, you have to go out and earn it. You have to go talk to every delegate. You have to have those direct conversations because delegates are the ones that actually pull the lever in the convention. And so they want to know, can they trust me to both run the office and then also that they share the conservative values that I have? And if that's the case, then let's go there together. And we feel great about the convention. Came out with a strong number and unified, ready to go into November.
So basically you're saying the delegates came to you?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. They came to me and asked if I would consider this. Now, in all candor, I said no initially, that I wasn't in a position to consider it. And part of that is because Senator Banks had endorsed one of the other candidates. And while I'm on leave, I work for Senator Banks. And so I knew better than running ahead of your own boss, either politically or otherwise. But we saw the challenges that the Secretary of State had, especially some of those most recent ones, and that's what really turned the corner to say we need to do something different.
Before last month, some Hoosiers had never heard of Max Engling, right? So why should they trust you with one of the state's most important constitutional offices?
Yeah, so and you're right, there are folks around the state that hadn't heard of me prior to this race. And part of that is because a lot of my effort in the last 3+ years has been in the middle part of the state, working with 20 or so counties right here very aggressively. So the folks in those counties, they definitely know who I am, and we've been acquainted for a long time now. But I would also say that I've been operating in Republican politics and policy for the last 20 years. And so I feel very strongly about the ability to say, how do we take good policy, good conservative policy, turn that into law for some of the priorities we have at the Secretary of State's office, and make sure that the Secretary of State has the authority to move forward with things like defending our election integrity and taking our conservative values in Indiana forward.
You told delegates that you were a Christian, a husband, a father, and a conservative. What's something voters should know about Max Engling that has nothing to do with politics?
So one, I'm one of 8 kids. I'm the second oldest of 8 kids. And part of what that means is that you have to work for everything that you have. There's not a lot of extra money running around. And so I worked through college. I went to Ivy Tech. I went to IUPUI and got my degree. And I then later went to the Naval War College as a civilian and got my master's degree in strategic planning and national defense. But part of that work, kind of a cool story, is that when I was working through college at IUPUI, I worked construction. And one of the major projects that we worked on was the extension on the Community North Hospital here in Indianapolis. And one of my jobs was to go to every patient room and lay the floor. So pulling the concrete, making sure it's all even, and then so that folks could come in and lay the tile and everything else on top of it. And later, my son was born at that hospital in one of the rooms that I had constructed when I was working my way through college. And it was a very, very cool full circle moment to say something that I had worked on directly, now we're using, and our son was born here.
Wow. How many kids do you have?
We have 4 kids.
Wow.
We're very blessed. We have 3 girls and a boy.
Looking back on last weekend, 2 rounds of voting over several hours, was this election about delegates rejecting the incumbent or embracing Max Engling, or both?
I think the delegates were saying, how do we unify around somebody that we can run forward with, that we trust to run the office, unify around somebody that has direct experience in this office too. So of the candidates that are running now, I'm the only one that has direct experience in the role of the Secretary of State's office. So one, working with small businesses here in Indiana. I've also filed my own small business here. But then part of it too is when I was in Washington, D.C., I worked for the Chief Elections Committee in the U.S. House. I did that for 8 years. And then also worked on building the coalition on the legislative side to say, how do we take good conservative policy and get that across the finish line? Mm-hmm. And so I think the delegates were looking for somebody that they could get behind as a unified party to move forward and win in the fall, but also has the experience to do this job well.
If elected, what specifically would you do differently than Secretary Morales?
Yeah, there's a handful of things. So one, we know the transition period is going to be very important. If the voters in Indiana say, Max, we want you in this role, the transition period will be important to make sure we're setting new procedures, new processes, so that we run the office with the highest of integrity, but also things like an election transparency portal. So citizens could report to the Secretary of State issues that they see, challenges, potential fraud that they see across the state, and that could be received by the Secretary of State's office to evaluate. I think also being more proactive on the election integrity side, specifically around folks that are maybe here legally, but not citizens, and so they're ineligible to vote. Right now, we need to have, what we're putting forward is to work with the State House to have a different color background on an ID of somebody that is not here as a citizen. And so that way, if they do attempt to register to vote or bring that ID into a polling place, it'd be very easy to see that this person is not eligible to vote. And I worked as an inspector in the last election. It would be very straightforward to say this person is not eligible to vote here. And then another piece is closing our primaries. So it's been talked about a lot. But I'm very adamant that we need to close our primaries here in Indiana. And it's not a partisan issue. There are states across the ideological spectrum in the United States that have closed primaries with good voter participation. And there's legislation right now at the State House that we can get behind to press that across the finish line. So excited for that opportunity. Feel very strongly that we're going to be able to make some of these positive changes.
And we're going to talk about the closing the primary a little bit later. You got a fairly late start in this race, running against opponents who had spent months courting delegates. Now that you've secured the nomination, will your strategy change? How do you plan to move forward?
Well, certainly strategies change from a convention race to a general election race. And so, yes, running statewide, you have coordination with all of your counties. Mm-hmm. You're aggressively out in the counties saying we're supporting our county parties, but also a big part of that is raising the money necessary, which we feel very good about, to get your name idea out there. And I think Hoosiers know that they want somebody they share conservative values with. They don't want what they see in Los Angeles, where they took weeks to count votes. They don't want what they see in New York City, where they're basically have an open competition to see who can be the most socialist. They don't want that in Indiana. And so our objective is to run hard and say, I am there to run a conservative race to uphold what we've built in Indiana already and not to turn into one of those other states or cities that Hoosiers don't want to be.
During your victory speech on Saturday, you outlined 3 major priorities for your campaign. 1, closing the primaries, making sure only citizens are voting in our elections, and stopping business fraud that we've seen around Shell trucking companies. We're going to get to all 3 of those. Let's start with closing the primaries, which you just mentioned. Under Indiana law, our primaries are restricted to people who either didn't vote in the last election but promised to vote for the party they're primarying with, or people who voted for that party in the last general election. This law has widely been viewed as kind of unenforceable since Indiana law doesn't require people to register with the party, and the state obviously does not track how you vote in a general election. Barring legislation from the General Assembly, how would you work to close Indiana's primaries? How does that work?
Yeah, so I wouldn't bar legislation. So I would say that you have to work with the State House to make this happen. The Secretary of State's office cannot do it unilaterally. You need to have a Secretary of State that can champion legislation like that, working with the State House partners to make sure you get it across the finish line. And that's where it's extremely helpful to have folks like J.D. Prescott, who have introduced legislation already, and folks like Senator Gaskell, he's my state senator as well, and he's the chairman of the Senate Elections Committee, saying that we understand this is where we are headed with closed primaries, and to work hand in hand with them to not only champion it through, but to build the coalition necessary to be able to do that. And so we're excited for this opportunity. We believe we'll be able to do it. And in fact, the party added it to their platform at the convention, that the party supports closed primaries here in Indiana. So I don't think it's asking too much for Republicans to vote in Republican primaries and for Democrats to vote in Democratic primaries. Pick the candidate that they believe is best and then send that person forward to the general election to determine who best fits that district.
In the most recent primary, we saw some really contentious contests in the state Senate with many incumbent senators who would oppose redistricting being challenged and in most cases being replaced by candidates endorsed by the president. In one of those races, District 23, the challenger, Paula Copenhaver, lost narrowly and has asked for a recount. We're still waiting for those results to come in. But in her petition, Copenhaver claims some of the votes for incumbent Spencer Deary were cast illegally under Indiana's primary law. So she's since withdrawn some of those challenges, but others still stand. She still has others out there. When we talked to some of the voters who were listed in that court filing that she challenged, and many told us that in heavily Republican districts where they live, voting in the Republican primary is the only way that they can have an impact on who represents them. And likewise in Marion County, which is a Democratic stronghold, many Republicans in Marion County vote in Democratic primaries for the same reason. So what do you say to those voters who say, look, we vote in these primaries because we want to have an impact. This is the only way we feel we can do something and have a voice?
Well, we know that the primaries and the party system is a club-based system. And so if you don't agree with the platform of that party, then you shouldn't be there voting to determine who is the outcome, who is the candidate that moves forward in that primary. If you're not willing to say, I am a Republican, or willing to say, I am a Democrat, then you shouldn't be the one that's crossing over to say, let me change the candidate that best fits this district. So the point is to take some of that ambiguity off the table from a race like you mentioned, where now there are cleaner lines and folks understand, here's how I can pick the best candidate that supports the values that I hold, that they hold, and then send that person forward to the general election.
Critics say taxpayers, though, fund those elections and all voters should have a say. Why are they wrong?
So voters would still have to have a say, the same way as it is now. We fund the primaries now, you would fund the primaries in a closed primary situation. And so the idea is simply that you have to determine that if you are a member of one party, or a member of another party, that's who you've decided to vote for, instead of crossing over to the other side that you disagree with, or at least don't agree with as closely. And so you still have the opportunity to vote in either of those elections. And it's just making clearer lines to ensure that these folks are voting according to their principles.
Moving on to your second point, making sure that only citizens are voting in our elections. This is an issue one of your opponents, Secretary Morales, has been focused on as well. In December, he and Attorney General Todd Rokita announced that an investigation had found that 21 non-citizens cast ballots in Indiana elections and that 165 non-citizens had registered to vote but had not cast ballots. Are you unsatisfied with the results of that investigation?
So I would say one, my opponent is not the Secretary of State. We're through the convention and we're moving forward into the general. But I would say I appreciated the work that he did around that investigation and the Attorney General did. They found the 21 folks and 165 others that had registered. And in my opinion, even one person that is here voting illegally is too many. And so what we need to do is make sure we are more proactive in our approach to ensuring that these folks are either not registering to vote if they're not a citizen, or not voting if they are here as a legal but non-citizen. And so I think that I appreciate the investigation that was done. I think that's very good information, but we also need to be more proactive to make sure there aren't even 21 or 156 to the numbers that you mentioned.
As they're pushed to verify only citizens are voting, letters were sent out to thousands of naturalized Hoosiers this year. They were told they needed to reprove their citizenship before being able to vote in this year's election. To be clear, these are people who legally immigrated and earned their citizenship. Is that something they need to be prepared to do again as you look into this issue?
My understanding is that was a one-time effort to help clean up some of the voter rolls and ensure that folks were here voting legally. We'll look at every situation that comes forward to make sure we're doing what's best for the state of Indiana to ensure only citizens are voting.
Okay. For a little context, Indiana has 4.8 million registered voters in 2024, and a little under 3 million of them cast ballots in that year's general election in 2024. That would mean that 21 ballots by non-citizens were cast. That represents 0.07% of all the votes cast in that 2024 election. So according to the Election Assistance Commission, Indiana rejected more than 3,000 ballots that year. In light of that, is voting by non-citizens the primary election integrity issue here?
So first, I'll say we have done a good job on the election integrity side here in Indiana. I think we're number 7 in the country. Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. We want to continue to build on that. And I would say that, like I mentioned, even one person that's voting illegally is too many. We've seen very close races in this last cycle, especially in some of our Senate seats, where those numbers matter. I'm not saying that those voters, happened in 2026, but I am saying that they're very tight races. And if we have folks that are here either registered to vote illegally or voting illegally, even if it's 21 folks, that's too many. One is too many, especially when we have these tight races that we've seen.
Democrats have argued that claims of widespread voter fraud are overblown, and that Indiana's low voter turnout is a bigger problem for the health of Indiana's political system. Looking back at those numbers from 2024, Indiana has just a 62% voter turnout number, one of the worst in the nation. Does it bother you that so many Hoosiers don't bother taking part in our elections?
So I am fully committed, if the voters send me forward into this role, to work as hard as we can to increase voter turnout. It's a huge thing in Indiana that we need to improve, and I fully agree with that. Part of that is making sure that folks have access to voter registration, and one of the initiatives that we're putting forward is to work more closely with our veterans organizations to make sure that we are proactively getting them the information necessary to register to vote, whether that's with our county veteran service officers or working with some of our veterans organizations to make sure that happens. But I do think the Secretary of State needs to be focused on how do we get folks, both on the campaign side, energized to come out, but also on the official side of the office, registered and understanding the opportunity to vote so that we do drive those numbers up.
Why do you think people don't come out?
That's a good question. I think sometimes folks can maybe have some apathy. Maybe you see some challenges across the country that you think are harder to be solved. I understand that. But I also think we need, as Hoosiers, to make sure we're doing our part to lean in to good government, to elect the folks that can make those positive changes. And you have to have somebody that can help bring that message and energize the voters here in Indiana.
Before you entered the race, there was a senior Indiana election official who was on the Indiana Election Commission. She raised concerns about what she felt was a lack of investment in training for county election boards under Secretary Morales. This was a warning from a Republican about a fellow Republican Secretary of State. She ended up resigning over those concerns. And at the time, she was calling on, this is before you entered the race, calling on Republicans to nominate David Shelton. What do you say to voters who share her concerns about the integrity of this year's election?
So I think the biggest question there was, how do we get resources to folks at the county level? I think that is very important. I've talked with many folks around the Secretary of State's office, inside and outside, that are prepared to move forward with new resources for the county election officials, whether that's the clerk or the county election boards. Right now, there's not a lot of standardization around, say, curriculum for training poll workers or curriculum for helping new clerks to onboard. And so I think that it just requires a Secretary of State and a team in the Secretary of State's office that can use the resources they already have, build a curriculum, not something mandatory, not something that you tell the clerks in 92 counties you have to do this, but opportunities to use resources to help them do their jobs better. And if they want to take an off-the-shelf poll worker training program out and say, we're going to implement this, in Clark County, wonderful. Then we want to give them those opportunities so they don't have to expend their own resources or figure out 92 fully different ways to do that across the state.
Why not make it mandatory? Why not say, hey, this is really important, do this?
It's important for the Secretary of State to keep the election administration at the county level. I am home rule. I'm a believer in home rule, that the government is better when pressed closest to the people. And so they can handle that administration. But as a Secretary of State, as the chief elections officer in the state of Indiana, you do have a responsibility to offer those resources to these clerks and to the county election board so that if they want to use them, then they certainly have it available.
During your speech at the convention, you said that if Republicans lost the office of Secretary of State, they could lose everything else. What did you mean by that?
So we've already seen where Democrats have put a lot of money into, say, prosecutors' offices, because they know that you can change the culture of a city or county if you can run the prosecutor's office. We also know that we've seen that they've put a lot of money into elections officers, and like the Secretary of State in many states. And so if you do that, if you can then run them on the Democratic side, you have an opportunity to bring all kinds of new for Democrats, new initiatives that folks here in Indiana do not want to see. Things like extensive mail-in balloting, where the state sends out ballots to folks that haven't even requested them, that we've seen in the past, or ballot harvesting, or a week to count the votes like we saw in Los Angeles. Things that Hoosiers don't want. And so that's what I mean by changing the state. And I think we have to be very careful, and that we're running strong elections, but also that we're moving forward in the conservative strength that we've built here in Indiana.
There was an effort in the General Assembly last session to shorten the period of early voting. It ultimately failed. What do you think about that?
I do think it's important to shorten early voting. I think there is a role for early voting. However, when I talk to clerks around the state, in a 1-month early voting period, the first 2 weeks of that are very often slow. And so I think it has an undue burden to a lot of clerks and counties around the state to administer elections for that long prior to the election. So what I think would be helpful is to bring it to 2 weeks of early voting, but to also extend the hours so that folks that are working can go after work or before work and make sure that they have an excellent opportunity to vote in person before the election, but to shorten that overall window.
Where do you stand with voting centers versus precincts? A lot of counties have moved to voting centers. Some still have precinct voting.
Yeah, so it's up to the county to make that decision on their own, whether they want to be a precinct voting county or whether they want to move to vote centers. I live in Hamilton County. We're a precinct voting county. I think there is one of the positives of moving to vote centers is that there are a fewer number of poll workers that you would need to recruit. That's a good thing as far as expenses are concerned. But I think also you have to be very careful that you have voting stations, centers, precinct voting very close to the voters. So for example, I live in Cicero, and if you go, there's a straw town that's just east of me. It's a small town. They vote just north. It's about a half-mile north to get up to Walnut Grove. It's an easy drive. What I wouldn't want to do is disenfranchise the folks that are in the straw town to easily access their voting center or their precinct voting. So if a county is deciding that they want to move towards vote centers, they need to take into account the population centers, certainly, but they also need to take into account very strongly the geographic representation of these vote centers. So you're not simply putting them only in the urban or suburban areas, but you're spreading them out so that our folks that live in a rural area like I do have good access to these areas to vote. And I would say it is up to the counties. the Secretary of State should not be dictating down to the counties how they should decide on vote centers.
Republicans have had complete control of Indiana state government for 12 years and have controlled the governorship, House, and Senate since 2011. A Democrat hasn't been elected Indiana Secretary of State since Joe Hogsett in 1989. If there are still concerns about election integrity in Indiana, is it fair to say that that responsibility lies with Indiana Republicans?
I think that's why I said we're building on what we've done here. We're number 7 in the country. That's good. And I think that I have given that respect to the Secretary of State as we've moved in the right direction there. But there are things that we can still do to build on election integrity, like tightening up some of the protocol around having only citizens voting here. So I think, and part of it too is the Office of Secretary of State is bigger than just the elections. Now, certainly, that's the primary responsibility of the Secretary of State. But there's things that you can do that are broader than that. And one of them is, and we'll probably address this, but is the shell trucking companies that we've seen that have popped up around the state. It's a real challenge. There are dangerous drivers that are on the road with Hoosiers right now. We saw in Jay County not too long ago, 4 folks died. And we need to be doing everything we can at the state level to make sure that we are pushing back on these dangerous drivers. Now, I'm going to give credit to the Attorney General, Todd Rokita. He's done great work on this in his office. The State House has made some changes as well to continue to go after this challenge. Mm-hmm. But the Secretary of State does play a key role in it. And one of those things is that in the Business Registration Division, they see the incoming business registrations directly. They're the first line of defense on this fraud. And if you see something, for example, like 14 identical LLCs being registered to one home address in Greenwood, then it's incumbent on the Secretary of State to gather that data, to say here is an anomaly, and to work with the Attorney General and others to then further investigate and potentially prosecute if they see something there that needs to be resolved.
Would you support automatically revoking an Indiana business registration if a company loses its federal operating authority?
So I think I'm cautious of anything that's automatic, but I would say that we need to do a much better job of seeing that information at the federal side, comparing it to what we know here from the Business Registration Division, and then working with the Attorney General to make sure that folks that are in violation are held accountable.
So how many staff and resources do you believe would be needed to implement these kind of changes and really tackle this issue?
So I don't think it takes very many staff or resources at all. The information is already coming in to the Secretary of State's office. I've filed a small business there myself. It's very straightforward. We want it to remain straightforward as well. We want Indiana to be open to new businesses. We want folks to create small businesses and hire Hoosiers. But we also can see that information directly at the Secretary of State's office. And so using the folks, the staff that are already in those roles to capture the data more efficiently, I think is important. So then you can then compare the data against itself to find those anomalies. So it doesn't require a huge lift from the Secretary of State's office. It requires intentionality and a Secretary of State that sees this as the major problem that it is.
Trucking is a major industry in Indiana. Are you concerned about pushback from carriers or industry groups if you pursue stricter oversight?
Not at all, because the folks that are doing this well have come to me and said, we have to have something happen to resolve this problem. The folks that are operating well are wonderful logistics and carriers across the state. They want to see these dangerous drivers taken off the road even more than other folks do, because they understand how it drags down their industry and it paints them in a bad picture when they're doing everything properly and by the rules. So I think they want to see this cleaned up just as much, if not more, as other folks that are on the road.
You spent a lot of time in Washington, working in Washington. Your former opponents in the Republican race and now in the general election have accused you of parachuting in, so to speak, and being a so-called tool of the Republican establishment. That's the Democrats and your opponents now. How do you respond to those allegations?
So one, it's a little ridiculous in my opinion. So I've lived here, worked for a number of small businesses here, worked my way through college, went to Ivy Tech, went to IUPUI, met my wife here, married my wife here. We were married at the same church that we attend now. And I've worked and put food on the table for a family of 6 here in Indiana. Yes. Did I go to serve in Washington when conservatives went out to Washington to say, we're going to press back on the Obama administration and put good policy forward? Yes, I did go out to serve, and I worked for, like I mentioned, the Chief Elections Committee out there. And then I returned home because I want to continue serving here in Indiana. And so I think when folks push back on whether you're a Hoosier or not, I think it is a little bit ridiculous in this case, because all of the markers that I've put forward are the elements of somebody who is here, who is home here, and wants to remain here with my wife and children.
From your time in Washington, what lessons did you learn there and through that work that you plan to bring back here to Indiana and to this office should you win?
Yeah, a big part of it is coalition building. So how do you work with a legislature to get good conservative policy across the finish line? There's a lot of folks in the State House that have a whole bunch of good but sometimes competing ideas. And so not only championing your idea, that doesn't mean you take an idea like closing the primaries and force it through the State House. That doesn't work. You have to have the energy to bring it through the State House, but you also have to be able to work with those partners that all have great and sometimes competing ideas and build a coalition around what would make Indiana successful through this piece of legislation. And part of that is working directly with our Clerks Association. And I'm very committed to making sure that everything that we do in this role is not creating burden for the sake of burden. It is to say, how do we create an efficient but conservative policy that works well both at the statewide and county level.
You've run for office before in that crowded field, challenging Congresswoman Victoria Spartz for her seat in District 5 in the 2022 primary. What lessons did you take away from that race, Max?
So while I was not successful, a few things that stand out to me. One is that after I came in third place out of 9 folks that were in that race, I went back to the Congresswoman that won, Victoria Spartz, and said, I'm on the team. I know that it's important to hold this seat and to make sure that our conservative values are held in the 5th Congressional District, and supported her in that race. And then she has come back and endorsed me in this race as well, because she believes the same thing about the Secretary of State's office. I will say it was an awesome opportunity to travel around Indiana and talk with the people in Rushville and the people in Strawtown, like I mentioned, and across the 5th Congressional District to hear what is happening that's going really well in your life, but also where are the challenges? And then how do we work to make sure that we can solve some of those things? And then sometimes, and importantly, how do we work to make sure that the government is out of your lives in a lot of these? And so while I was not successful, it was an excellent opportunity to grow closer with my neighbors here in Indiana.
I mean, you were successful this time, and in your victory speech, you talked about, okay, let's move forward together as a team. How easy do you think that will be to do?
Yeah, and that is what I'm committed to, is moving forward together as a Republican team. And I believe that's why I was put forward by the delegates in the second round to say we want to coalesce around Max so that we can run in the fall as strong as possible and make sure that we do uphold our values, our shared conservative values. And so I know that it was a contentious convention. I understand that. I also appreciate that about Republicans, because we are free thinkers that want to come up with a bunch of good ideas and competing ideas and say, how do we figure out what is the best one? But then after we've had those discussions, we come back together to say, we're a team, we're a unified Republican Party, from all of the statewides down to the voters, to say, let's push forward and make sure that we can do this together. And I feel very confident about that opportunity to move forward together and win in November as a Republican team.
In November, you're going into a pretty crowded field. In addition to Bo Bai for the Democrats, there's Lori Schillings for the Libertarian Party, and former Indianapolis Mayor Greg Ballard has said that he has more than enough signatures to get on the November ballot under the Lincoln Party. How do you feel about Hoosier voters having so many options?
So we're committed to running our conservative race. We know Hoosiers don't want what they've seen from the left. But also, if Mayor Ballard gets in, I welcome him into the race. I think Ballard and Bai are competing for the same votes. Those votes are the anti-Republican, anti-Donald Trump, anti-Max Engling vote. And they can go split those votes amongst themselves. Hoosiers are smart. They don't want what they've seen in California. They don't want what they've seen in New York City. They want somebody that shares their values, that they can get behind to run and win in November, and we feel very confident about that opportunity.
Schillings has announced that she wants to win 10% of the vote in the upcoming election. That's the threshold for libertarians to get on the primary ballot, like Republicans and Democrats are right now. Ballard, who formerly identified as a Republican, is expected to target less conservative Republican voters along with more business-minded Democrats. He says he wants to go after disillusioned voters from both parties. How will you work to keep moderate and libertarian-leaning Republicans with the party?
So my goal is to run a strong and tight race that gives people the confidence to say, we trust Max to run this office with integrity, to run this office well, efficiently, and with the values that we share. And I think that whether you are on the more conservative or more moderate side of the spectrum, you want somebody that is going to run the office well. And that is what I bring to the table here. So we're running a tight race to win in the fall, and I believe that every voter, it's great that they have choices, and we feel very strongly that those voters will come to my side to make sure that we can win in November and uphold their values in the Secretary of State's office.
Finish this sentence. 4 years from now, if Hoosiers are saying Max Engling is a successful Secretary of State, it is because why? 1,
we closed the primaries. 2, that we have ensured even more proactively that only citizens are voting here in Indiana. And then I think another piece is this transparency portal that we're putting forward for elections, that you have confidence that we are doing everything possible to make sure we have the most secure, highest integrity elections, and that ideally nothing would be coming in through the elections portal because people have high confidence in our elections. But you have to have that opportunity for folks to say, hey, I see something that may potentially be a challenge. So I would say those are the biggest things that we're putting forward. And if we accomplish those things, we feel very good about doing this job successfully.
Max Engling, Republican nominee for Secretary of State, thanks for sitting down with us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Emily. It's great to be
it.
here.